In my last two videos, I introduced the regress argument for epistemic foundationalism and argued that the foundations of knowledge must be internal. Although classical foundationalism has impressive historical precedent, it is currently unpopular. In contemporary epistemology, the prevailing opinion is that classical foundationalism is simply outdated and untenable. In this video, I wish to challenge this assumption and argue that rumors of foundationalism's death are premature. Foundationalism is more than capable of meeting the objections leveled against it. This is a defense of classical foundationalism. Foundationalism is a theory of epistemic justification, according to which all beliefs come in two types, inferential and non-inferential. Inferential beliefs obtain justification from the non-inferential beliefs. And according to classical foundationalism, these non-inferential beliefs must be certain. Specifically, they must be incorrigible. Perhaps no argument is more frequently raised against this account than that it is somehow self-refuting. It is argued that belief in classical foundationalism itself isn't incorrigible or traceable to beliefs that are, and that therefore it is unjustified by its own criteria. Alvin Plantinga has probably done more than anyone to propagate this idea. He claims that classical foundationalism appears to be self-referentially incoherent. It does not meet the conditions for justification that it lays down. For according to classical foundationalism, a belief is justified for me if and only if either it is properly basic for me or accepted on the evidential basis of beliefs that are properly basic and support it. But this belief itself is not properly basic, and it is at least extremely hard to see that it is evidentially supported by beliefs that do meet that condition. Plantinga correctly notes that classical foundationalism would need to be either incorrigible or evidenced by beliefs that are in order to be justified. Obviously, I will not be arguing that belief in foundationalism itself is incorrigible. However, I have spent quite a lot of time arguing against alternatives in my previous videos. If the problems with these alternatives hold, then these problems count as evidence in favor of classical foundationalism. It is not controversial that incorrigible beliefs are capable of serving as a foundation for knowledge. Plantinga himself seems to grant this, saying, according to the Cartesian tradition, we have privileged epistemic access to these matters. We have incorrigible knowledge of these matters. Here the tradition seems quite right. This tradition is also right in seeing some of this knowledge as incorrigible, or at any rate nearly so. If it has been conceded that we do in fact have incorrigible beliefs, then the critic of classical foundationalism needs to identify another sort of belief that is capable of serving as a foundation. Until this has been done, incorrigible beliefs stand as being the only type of beliefs capable of conferring justification. Of course, Plantinga offers an alternative, which we explored and rejected in our last video, but the crucial point is that since evidence was offered against the alternative, we have given evidence for foundationalism. As long as no alternative to incorrigibility remains, we have justification for thinking it is the only means of non-inferential justification. Thus, foundationalism is at least in principle traceable to incorrigible beliefs, and hence does not necessarily fail to meet its own standards. As John DePoe concludes, there is no reason to believe that classical foundationalism could not in principle be accepted on the evidential basis of propositions that are acceptable to the advocate of classical foundationalism and that support it deductively, inductively, or abductively. At best, the inability to infer classical foundationalism using principles compatible with classical foundationalism is a contingent matter. Thus, classical foundationalism is not self-refuting. Having vindicated foundationalism from the charge of self-refutation, let's turn to a more serious objection. Some critics of foundationalism claim that there are no incorrigible beliefs. As we noted in a previous video, incorrigible beliefs are not subject to being corrected, reformed, or improved. If it were true that there are no incorrigible beliefs, the consequences would be devastating indeed. Incorrigible beliefs are the only sort of beliefs which can, in principle, confer justification. If there are no such beliefs, then skepticism follows. But why take seriously the suggestion that there are no incorrigible beliefs? After all, it seems quite evident that beliefs such as that I am in pain, or that I see a blue book, are not subject to being corrected by any new information. Nonetheless, critics think that there are examples which show that such beliefs can in fact be corrected. Scott Eichen gives the following illustration. Comic book hero Punisher takes a prisoner for questioning. The prisoner is faithful to his master, and Punisher is in a hurry, so Punisher threatens to torture the prisoner with a hot poker. He goes to the fire nearby, retrieves a hot poker, and unbeknownst to the prisoner, Punisher switches the poker out with a popsicle. Punisher runs the popsicle down the prisoner's back where he can't see it, and the prisoner thinks he's being burned. The prisoner feels a cold sensation, but believes he feels a hot one. From examples such as this, Eichen concludes, cases like hot poker are situations where a subject has a belief about what's given, yet could be wrong about it. They function as counterexamples, and they are cases where a revision to the infallibility thesis is required. However, examples such as this do not in fact challenge the idea that we have any incorrigible beliefs. At best, they show that some types of vague experiences do not yield incorrigible beliefs, but we need not even concede this point. Even beliefs formed in response to vague experiences preceded by misleading expectations are incorrigible with respect to the content of the experience itself. As Timothy McGrew argues, psychosomatic experiences are hard to investigate. But there is some reason to believe that, especially under conditions of heavy and systematic suggestion, an individual's anticipations will play a major role in determining the type of sensations he experiences. We must not confuse the physical stimulus with the felt sensation. The two, though normally causally related, are not identical. Even though in Eichen's example, the prisoner is wrong about what is causing the sensation due to misleading circumstances, the belief that he feels a hot burning sensation remains incorrigible. Indeed, Eichen's illustration presupposes that there is a level of incorrigibility to the belief. For how else could the prisoner determine that he was mistaken for believing he was burned if he couldn't independently determine that this was indeed what he had felt? Thus I conclude that counterexamples to incorrigibility are not successful in showing that we have no incorrigible beliefs. Undoubtedly, the most serious objection to foundationalism is the Sylasian Dilemma. This dilemma attempts to show that whatever is identified as a foundation for knowledge will either require justification and therefore be incapable of terminating an epistemic chain, or else it will be too insignificant to serve as a foundation. Although the dilemma takes its name from its originator, Wilfrid Sellars, the argument was presented in its strongest form through the early work of Laurence Bonjour. As such, we will concern ourselves with Bonjour's version of the argument. He formulates it as follows. Suppose that there are basic empirical beliefs, that is, empirical beliefs A which are epistemically justified, and B whose justification does not depend on that of any further empirical beliefs. For a belief to be epistemically justified requires that there be a reason why it is likely to be true. For a belief to be epistemically justified for a particular person requires that this person be himself in cognitive possession of such a reason. The only way to be in cognitive possession of such a reason is to believe with justification the premises from which it follows that the belief is likely to be true. The premises of such a justifying argument for an empirical belief cannot be entirely a priori. At least one premise must be empirical. Therefore, the justification of a supposed basic empirical belief must depend on the justification of at least one other empirical belief, contradicting one. It follows that there can be no basic empirical beliefs. Premise 1 simply describes foundationalism. Premise 2 is true by definition. Premise 3 is true under internalism, which I argued is the best approach to epistemology in my last video, hence I will concede that premise 3 is true. The argument breaks down with premise 4. Bonjour assumes that the only way in which a belief can be justified is by another belief, but this is an assumption which the foundationalist is entitled to reject. The foundationalist maintains that the subject needs to be aware of a reason that justifies his foundational beliefs. But to insist that this justifying reason must be another belief begs the question against foundationalism. But Bonjour is still free to ask what sort of reason can justify a belief that is not also a belief. Throughout this series, I have consistently appealed to the theory of direct acquaintance. Direct acquaintances are what justify our foundational beliefs. Richard Fumerton explains, on the acquaintance theory of non-inferential justification, one has non-inferential justification for believing that P when one is directly acquainted with the fact that P, the thought that P, and the correspondence between the thought and its truth maker. The idea of acquaintance is important because it is able to stop the regress of justification or beliefs in such a way that it allows for our most foundational beliefs to be justified without the justifier itself needing further justification. Beliefs have the capacity to be false, thus they need justification. Acquaintances, by contrast, are simply non-propositional experiences or states of awareness. Experiences or states of awareness can't be false. Thus they are capable of conferring justification, but they don't require any justification themselves. Acquaintance is a powerful and important part of internalist foundationalism because it explains how our most basic beliefs can themselves be justified without appealing to other beliefs. Once again, Fumerton's comments are insightful. Acquaintance is a real relation that obtains only between existing relata. While one can believe that which is false, one cannot be acquainted with that which doesn't exist. For this reason, it is highly misleading to describe acquaintance as an intentional state. Because acquaintance is a real relation that requires real relata, justification constituted in part by acquaintances guarantees the truth of the belief it justifies. Thus, the theory of direct acquaintance solves the dilemma by offering a means of justification that is strong enough to support knowledge, but requires no further justification due to its non-propositional character. Acquaintances are neither true nor false, they just are. As Brie Gertler explains, the acquaintance theory provides an alternative picture of justification. On this picture, an introspective judgment is justified by the subject's directly grasping the correspondence between the judgment and the mental state it concerns. The mental state thus contributes to justifying the judgment, but its contribution does not involve causing or entailing the judgment. Instead, it involves corresponding to the judgment and thereby rendering the judgment accurate. Bonjour counters this solution by saying, this reply to the objection seems hopelessly contrived and ad hoc. If such a solution were acceptable, one is inclined to expostulate that any sort of regress could be dealt with in a similar fashion. The point is not that such a move is always incorrect, but merely that the nature and possibility of such a convenient intermediate needs to be clearly and convincingly established. It seems that Bonjour has no real argument against the possibility of direct acquaintance. His response amounts to nothing more than a complaint that the theory seems contrived and that the reality of acquaintance has not been demonstrated. But what exactly does Bonjour expect from the foundationalist at this point? Is the foundationalist somehow expected to show his direct acquaintance to Bonjour? How exactly would one do this? Direct acquaintance is, by nature, a private, first-person experience. If I am directly acquainted with the fact that it appears to me that there is a blue book before me, I have no way to prove this acquaintance to anyone, but that does nothing to undercut the justification that it provides. Olaf Tollefsen correctly points out, surely one does not want to say that the skeptic's failure to know an incorrigible truth as such undercuts the cognitive certainty for someone who does know an incorrigible truth as such. All that is left is for the skeptic to complain that he does not know any incorrigible truth as such. That may be true, but it is no reason for someone who does know an incorrigible truth as such to suppose that he does not. While Bonjour's objection to acquaintance is little more than a complaint, Stephen Porter has offered a much more serious argument against acquaintance. He argues that acquaintance construed as non-conceptual awareness is incoherent. He writes, This is not merely to insist that a non-conceptual awareness is incapable of serving as a reason, rather that a non-conceptual awareness is a contradiction in terms. This is because it seems clear that any kind of perceptual awareness is an awareness as this or that, and that such perceptual awareness is conceptual in nature. Such awareness is inherently conceptual, for concepts just are those features of cognition that make our awareness of or about some particular. But why should the proponent of direct acquaintance grant Porter's assumption that perceptual awareness is awareness of something as something? It seems that conceptualization requires an object to be conceptualized, and that therefore awareness has a logical priority over conceptualization. Moreover, it seems that we have clear examples of awareness without conceptualization. As Paul Moser argues, there is good reason to hold that one can have one's attention attracted by some ostensibly presented object, but refrain from subsuming this object under some concept. Consider the common phenomenon of one's attention being attracted by something, say a gunshot, at one instant, while at the next instant something else, say a loud ringing of a bell, attracts one's attention. Typically in such a case, one does not have time to conceptualize what initially attracted one's attention. Such a case thus provides a familiar example of non-conceptual attention attraction. Hence, Porter's objection is both unsubstantiated and conflicts with common experience. As such, it may be dismissed. I've now defended the theory of direct acquaintance as the solution to the Sylasian Dilemma at some length. We have seen that the theory exhibits outstanding resilience to objections. It is noteworthy that Bonjour himself ultimately laid down his sword against foundationalism and essentially embraced this solution to his own dilemma. In later work he writes, "But although I confess to being one of those who has in the past been influenced by this objection, it now seems to me that the conclusion simply doesn't follow from the premises. For even if we grant, and indeed insist, that the specific content of the experience is itself non-propositional and non-conceptual, it, like various other types of non-conceptual phenomenon, can of course be described with various degrees of detail and precision." One final objection to acquaintance foundationalism is known as the problem of the speckled hen. Consider having a visual experience of a hen. Consider further that this hen has 48 speckles. Most of us would have a hard time justifiably believing that the hen had this specific number of speckles, despite being directly acquainted with this fact. How then is direct acquaintance really sufficient for justification? Although the traditional illustration is a speckled hen, the same point can be extrapolated to any complex experience. How many blades of grass am I acquainted with when I am directly acquainted with a grassy field? How many horizontal lines am I acquainted with when I am directly acquainted with a plaid pattern? It is argued that we should know the answers to these questions if direct acquaintance is capable of playing the justifying role that foundationalists claim it does. Ernest Sosa argues, if the classical foundationalist wishes to have a theory, he needs to tell us which sorts of features are the epistemically effective ones. Having a visual image with 48 speckles seems not to qualify, whereas having a visual image with 3 speckles may. What is the difference? The full dimensions of this problem for foundationalist epistemology have not yet been fully appreciated. To resolve this problem, we must remember that the theory of direct acquaintance requires not just direct acquaintance with a fact, but also with the thought as well as the correspondence that holds between the fact and the thought. In the case of the speckled hen, one is not acquainted with the belief that the hen has 48 speckles, and therefore is not acquainted with the relevant correspondence. Rather, they are simply acquainted with the fact that the hen is speckled. Bonjour correctly observes, the person must apprehend or recognize the agreement or fit between the aspect of experience being attended to and the conceptual description of the given belief. In cases where people fail to see or apprehend such agreement, the corresponding belief will not be justified. But this, I submit, has no bearing at all on the other cases where they are successful. Once we acknowledge that direct acquaintance requires more than a simple acquaintance with a fact, but also with the correspondence between the fact and the belief, it becomes evident that the problem of the speckled hen disappears. As John DePoe concludes, the alleged problem surfaces by confusing a necessary condition for a sufficient one. What is missing in alleged counterexamples like the speckled hen is the satisfaction of the third necessary condition for epistemic justification, direct acquaintance with the truth-bearing relationship that holds between one's grounds and one's belief. In this video, we have examined 4 common objections to classical foundationalism. Although these objections have helped us to nuance our understanding of classical foundationalism more carefully, none of them has succeeded in showing that it is an inadequate theory of epistemic justification. No other theory is able to provide both an objective connection to reality, as well as intellectual assurance of that connection nearly as well. As such, those interested in having assurance that their beliefs accurately reflect reality would do well to embrace classical foundationalism.